The Vibe Catch podcast brings you the latest in employee engagement, workforce productivity, and people analytics. Today we continue the conversation we started in the previous episode with Dasa Suissa on employee engagement. And for those of you who just landed on this podcast, you might want to check the previous episodes we did as well. You can find the link in the description of the podcast and on the podcast page. And don't forget to subscribe to get the latest episodes right in your inbox. Hello Dasha, and welcome back.
Hello, good to see you again.
Thank you for joining us. And if I remember our last conversation where we left off, we talked and we hinted a little bit about the mindset that us as leaders, as individuals, maybe have to display in order for reaching a higher level of engagement within our companies. And I would like to expand that conversation today. Why do you think the mindset is important when talking about employee engagement?
Right, okay. So let me first maybe start with untangling what I mean by mindsets. So mindset is something that is associated with our very often unconscious beliefs, and these beliefs is exactly what impacts our behaviors. So going back to what we discussed last time, if my belief is that employees are here as my resources, as my assets, I will always treat them as assets and as resources. And I don't know if you can feel it that way, but deep down there's like a very mechanical approach.
It is. It feels like coins in my pocket. I have them there.
Yes.
I know that they're there. I know that I can use them to buy something with those coins, but they're just coins.
Exactly. And let's be honest, human beings are not exactly working in the same way as robots. Yeah. So we are emotional beings, and our emotions have huge impact on our levels of energy, on the pace of work, on our levels of motivation, and ultimately on our levels of engagement. And then our levels of engagement have a direct impact on our performance. So it's quite a long chain of cause and effect, but it is genuinely the mindsets we hold that cause whether or not our employees ultimately will be engaged and will be performing or not.
When you mention the mindset, when you talk about the mindset, and I do understand that that's something that we all hold as a hidden belief, as you mentioned it, or as an unconscious belief. But where do we start with changing that mindset within organization? Is that something that should be expected from every new employee to come with that mindset into a new job? Or is that something that companies should foster first and helping employees change that mindset?
Yes, so let's maybe clarify the link between mindsets and culture. So organizational culture is basically nothing else than shared values, shared mindset, shared beliefs. And if you really want to do something about employee engagement, then you first need to explore your current mindsets, your current culture, and also compare it with your desired or aspirational mindsets and culture. And don't get me wrong, this is a very arduous and potentially a very long process, because very often what I see companies doing is they engage in conversations about how we want to be, what cultures do we want to have, but they do not really engage in the more difficult part of that, which is about and where we are today.
I think that's also a very hidden, unconscious pattern in our behavior as humans, because we typically tend not to self-evaluate ourselves, because that's a painful process that hurts.
Yes.
Many times we tend to discover things that we don't like about ourselves. That's on an individual level, also on a company level. And I do feel that at that point we tend to bury it and say, well, maybe if I don't deal with it now, it will pass away. And as we all know from our life experiences, it always comes back if we don't deal with that particular issue. So I think that that's a very powerful thing that companies maybe should consider looking into it.
Definitely, and I agree with you that basically it comes down to individuals not being so sometimes ready or sometimes so willing to explore that, and they prefer to bury their heads in the sand. And organizations, let's be honest, do the same, because organizations as such don't exist. They're just collectives, and they are run by individuals. So if companies really want to explore their mindsets and their cultures, they also need to explore what mindsets and what beliefs individuals hold, or individual teams even hold, because that can be different in different parts of the organization.
Definitely. And the challenge, I think, for companies in today, it's even bigger, because everything changes so fast. I mean, we've been impacted by technology, and opinions are formed based on social situations, and we have access to so much more information. In fact, I feel I'm overloaded with information. It's such a digital noise that it's difficult to even focus anymore on what's right, what's not right, what is just there to influence, or what is real. And due to this fact, I think that companies also have the difficulty in actually maintaining a culture, like a straight culture, if you want to call it that way.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from what you're saying is that we're bombarded by the outside world, and I think that's part of the challenge, that many organizations are so much externally oriented. They look for answers outside of them. They try to copy practices of companies that have been successful. But again, what they don't realize is that they can copy behavior, they can copy practices, they can copy policies, but what they cannot copy are mindsets. And that is often why, if, for example, organizations try to imitate or just take some inspiration from Google or alike, they fail, and they don't realize why. But the answer is because they do not have the same mindsets.
I fully agree with you, and we also see a trend in companies taking advantage of some of the tools out there, getting pulse polls, getting different tools of measuring engagement, and then suddenly they get a lot of data, and they get a score, and but in most cases they really don't know what that means. It's just a number if you don't really tie it up to something. If it doesn't have, it's kind of the same thing as marketeers would say, well, we have 10,000 visitors per hour on our website. And the question will be, okay, what does that mean? Just visitors, or does that translate into anything? Does that translate into customers, into leads, into etc.? So the same thing with the practices that companies try to maybe copy or implement, or realize, oh, we have a problem, or oh, everybody's actually doing something. Let's jump on the same trend. Let's get a tool. Let's get some numbers, and we're all happy.
Exactly.
And we actually realized that it's not the case. It's just then maybe we call it a vanity metric, that companies try to employ a vanity metric and say, well, our employees are 78% engaged. what does that mean?
Exactly. And for every company, that will be something different, right? And even though we do have some definitions of what engagement is and isn't, every company has a unique context and a unique dynamic and a unique why it is important to measure things like that. And again, very often, companies jump onto implementing and doing because others are doing it as well, as you had mentioned, but they are not entirely sure, and they very often haven't explored why that is important in their particular case.
That comes back to the mindset that you mentioned before, the fact that if you don't have the mindset for change, for actually, then all the tools that you would throw at that particular problem, if you want to call it a problem, will not solve anything. It will just give you more data pointing you in the same direction, that nothing has changed. It's just, you just got more numbers now to look at.
Exactly. That's exactly it. So it does not really lead anywhere, does it?
No, it doesn't. I fully agree with you. What would, like you mentioned that companies should change their mindset, and I do feel that that's one of the key things. But how do you think that can happen? Like, what would be the catalysts or the drivers for the mindset to change?
Yes, so I genuinely believe that such change, the most prone department to catalyze such change is obviously HR department and or organizational development department. Every company operates differently, but let's also not forget the role of the actual leaders. And I believe that's potentially something we can explore in another podcast.
Definitely. We'd love to have you back. And talk about the leadership role and also the HR. I think that there is also a gap in that communication, or at least in that definition of roles. If you look at companies with different departments, you have the sales and the marketing and HR and finance, and I think that most of the departments somehow know their role. Like if you think of marketing, they need to generate more demand. They know that, promote the brand, etc. Sales to generate more revenue, and so forth. But then when it comes to HR, it's a little bit confusing in that sense. And we'd love to have you back in a new episode and to talk about the role of HR.
Okay, let's do that.
Thank you, Dasa.
Thank you.
Again. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Really interesting and powerful thoughts here. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, and for all of our listeners, all the resources that we mentioned in this podcast, you can find the links on the podcast page and in the podcast description. Till next time.
Thanks for listening to the VibeCatch podcast. Visit our website, vibecatch.com, for more resources and insights on employee engagement, human productivity, and HR technology. Don't forget to subscribe to get the latest podcast right in your inbox.